After they came back from the museum, Davina decided to go for a swim. She came into Will's room to see if he and Stanley wanted to go with her. Bennett growled. Stanley was never going to let him out of the room. On the way down, they met Carlson Marks, the boy who was always talking about magic. They were carrying the green swimming costumes that had been provided in their wardrobes and the green towels that were provided in their bathroom lockers, so it should have been obvious where they were going, but Carlson asked anyway. "Can I come?" he said, after Davina had told him. "Of course," replied Davina, and Carlson ran off to his room to get his things. She looked at the others and laughed. "I don't know why he wants my permission. Does he think I own the pool?" They changed in the changing rooms in the basement. Davina came running out and dived straight into the pool. She set off doing laps. Will jumped in and swam up and down a couple of times and then just hung around in the water, not doing anything in particular. A few strokes of freestyle, for instance, or a bit of backstroke, or whatever he fancied. Stanley got in and just floated, watching Davina as she passed him on her way up and down the pool. Then Carlson Marks arrived. He had brought another boy with him, Grover Higglethwaite. They jumped into the shallow end and started chasing each other and splashing water in each other's faces. Their shouts echoed off the ceiling. "No fighting in the pool, leaders," said the row guard that was sitting on the chair near the wall. "We weren't fighting, Chuck," said Grover. Row guards were all called Chuck or Ronald or Todd. The row guard shook his head. "No fighting or you'll have to get out, no exceptions." The two boys glanced slyly at each other. "Race!" said Grover suddenly, and they went splashing wildly down the pool. Grover swam into the wall and Carlson swam into Davina. She trod water for a moment, hit him on the head, and then kept going. Will got out. He sat down on the edge of the pool with his feet dangling in the water. Davina was still swimming steadily up and down, stroking rhythmically and kicking with a steady beat. Stanley floated. Carlson and Grover chased and splashed each other again, and the row guard kept calling out to them. After a while, Davina finished her laps. She rested in the shallow end and then got out. She laid her towel on the floor near Will and stretched on her back. "You're good," said Will. "Thanks. When I was little, I used to swim in the sea with my dad every day. That's hard. Swimming in a pool's easy." "Do you miss them?" said Will. "Your mum and dad, I mean." Davina grinned. "It hasn't even been a week yet, Will." "But I suppose you've talked to them." Davina shook her head, staring at the ceiling. "How would I have talked to them?" "You know," said Will, and gave her a meaningful glance. "You mean my communicator?" Who's got a communicator?" demanded Grover, as he pulled himself out of the pool. "No one," said Davina. "Do you always listen to other people's conversations?" "Only when they're talking right next to me," retorted Grover. "Well, why have you got a communicator? We weren't allowed to bring them." "I was," said Davina. "I don't believe you." "Don't you dare tell anyone, Grover." "Only if you let me use it." "You can use it if you want," said Davina. "It won't do you any good. It doesn't work." "You brought a broken communicator?" Grover shot a glance at Carlson and they both laughed. "No," said Davina. "It was working before I got here, but it doesn't work now." "Are you sure it's broken?" asked Will. "Why don't you give Stanley a look?" "Yes, give Stanley a look," said Carlson. "You know everything about programming, don't you, Stanley?" Stanley floated slowly to the edge of the pool, like a big white walrus drifting through the water. He climbed the ladder out of the pool. Water streamed off his skin. Davina glanced around to see if anyone else had come to the pool area while they were talking. Then she went into the changing room and came back with the micro-communicator. It was no bigger than a thumb, with a nail-sized screen. She handed it to Stanley. Stanley examined it briefly and gave it back to her. "Activate it," he said. Davina turned around and whispered something to the communicator. She sat next to Stanley and showed it to him. "See? Nothing. Just a blur." Stanley took the communicator and whispered something into it. He looked at it for a moment, then flipped open the back flap of the device, exposing the keypad. Microcommunicators didn't have a normal full keypad, but a miniature 4-button pad. He began pressing the buttons with the tip of his little finger. "Standard code?" asked Stanley. Davina shrugged. "I've never used the keypad. I've only ever used voice." Stanley kept pressing the buttons. Everyone watched. The only sound in the room was the lapping of the water against the sides of the pool. Eventually, Stanley gave the communicator back to Davina. "It's jammed." "See," said Davina. "I told you, it's broken, isn't it?" "No, it's jammed," said Stanley. "Someone's jammed it." "What do you mean?" "Maybe it's magic," whispered Carlson. "Someone's used an acid," said Stanley. Davina shook her head. "What's an acid? What are you talking about?" "An anti-communicator interference device," explained Stanley. "Your communicator's being blocked, Davina. Did you actually manage to use it before it stopped working? Once you got here, I mean." "The first time I activated it worked for about 5 seconds. I was trying to talk to my friend Roberta. I just said hello, and I was about to tell her about the academy, and then it went blank. I thought maybe it was because of the distance, or did it go blank or fuzzy?" Davina thought. "Fuzzy, then blank. I mean blurry, like it did just now." "You see, someone's jammed it," said Stanley. "You can't jam a communicator until you actually detect it working. The way a communicator works, every transmission is preceded by a unique digital code. That way, other communicators know where the comm is coming from and can screen it out if they're programmed to do that." "So when you use it, the acid detects the code," said Will. "And after that, it'll jam anything else starting with the code. Is that how it works, Stanley?" More or less. It can stop anything coming into the communicator as well by sending a continuous coded signal." "And you're allowed to do this?" asked Will. Stanley shrugged. "I think the police are allowed to do it if they get permission." "The police?" whispered Carlson, and he glanced over at Grover, who nodded his head, impressed. "So either someone's got permission to block Davina's microcommunicator," said Will, "or they're just doing it anyway." Davina laughed. "Serves me right for bringing it." "Wait a minute," said Will, thinking out loud. "If someone's using an acid to jam Davina's communicator, they must know she has one. Is that right, Stanley?" "They must know there's a communicator being used. They wouldn't necessarily know where it is." "But it wouldn't be too hard for them to find it?" Stanley shrugged. "If you've got an acid, you'll almost certainly have a tacid." "Which is?" "A tracking anti-communicator identification device." "But no one has tracked it," said Will. "Davina's still got it." "If you keep it switched off, they can't track it," said Stanley. "You can only track it when it's activated." "Like now?" said Will. "Turn it off!" cried Davina, tossing the communicator back to Stanley as if it were suddenly burning hot. Stanley laughed. "I've deactivated it already, don't worry." "But they could have tracked it just now when it was on, couldn't they?" said Will. "Yes," said Stanley. Grover and Carlson glanced at each other. Then they looked around quickly, as if they expected a squad of police to come storming through the doors or splashing out of the pool. Davina, Stanley, and Will couldn't keep themselves from looking around as well. But nothing happened. There was no one else there, only Chuck sitting on a chair near the wall, and Chuck was only a row guard. "Strange," said Will eventually. "They block it, but they don't track it. It's strange, don't you think?" "I won't be activating it again, that's for sure," said Davina, looking at the device with a shiver. "I think that's a good idea," murmured Stanley. Grover Higglethwaite looked at him with admiration. "You really know a lot about this stuff." "I told you," said Carlson. "Stanley knows everything about programming." "What's the best thing you've ever programmed, Stanley? What is it? Is it a game or a hover or a room or a robot or... I don't know. What else? What's the best thing?" "Yes, Stanley," said Davina mischievously. "What is it, Stanley? What's the best thing you've ever programmed? It wouldn't be a robot, would it?" "That'd be good," said Carlson enthusiastically. "It wouldn't be a animal, would it? Just imagine if you programmed, I don't know, a dog, for example." "Yes," cried Carlson. "Just imagine, Stanley. Could you do it? Could you program a road dog? Would it be as good as a real dog?" "Robots are never as good as a real thing," declared Grover. "You can never program a robot to be as good as a human being." "I was only talking about a dog, Grover," said Carlson. "Even a dog, it doesn't matter. Robots are never going to be as good." "They can be stronger," said Will. "So?" demanded Grover. "Well, they can be quicker," said Davina. "But can they be smarter?" retorted Grover. "No, a termite's smarter. Take football. You've got the robot teams and the human teams. Do you really think the Rogard Rangers could ever beat Manchester United?" They could if they ever got a chance, said Davina. I disagree. Why don't they ever let robot teams play humans then? Asked Carlson. If you're right, we'd beat them easily. That's the point, said Grover. Why bother? Oh, said Carlson. I didn't think of that. Rubbish, cried Davina. Grover, humans won't play the robots because we all know we'd lose. That's why there are separate leagues, isn't it, Will? Maybe we should ask what Chuck thinks, said Will, glancing at the row guard on the other side of the pool. Davina laughed. No, that's the point, said Grover with conviction. Robots are good for doing the same things over and over again. Go in and rescue someone when he's drowning. Yes, but you just can't program a robot to think. You can't program a robot to make it as good as a human in dealing with things it's never seen before. You can make it faster and stronger, but you can't make it smarter. And even in football, that's the thing that makes the difference. That's the thing that really matters. Even Segal and Begg said it was impossible. No one will ever be able to program a robot to be better than a human at thinking, he concluded, and he folded his arms as if that was the end of the matter. I will, said Stanley quietly. They all looked at Stanley in surprise. To try to do something that had been declared impossible by Segal and Begg, the inventors of robot technology, was no small ambition. Stanley nodded to himself. I'll do it one day, he muttered with determination. Don't make them too smart, Stanley, or they'll be able to program each other, said Davina. Carlson laughed. True, said Stanley. Carlson frowned. That would certainly make the world a different place, murmured Will, staring into the water. No one said anything to that. There was silence. The water lapped gently at the sides of the pool. The ripples in the surface glinted. Why do you think we were chosen? Said Will at last. He looked up at the others. Remember, Professor Gelmet said each one of us was carefully selected. He also said we shouldn't spend any time thinking about it, Grover reminded him. He said whatever we thought the reasons were, we'd almost certainly be wrong. That's what you would say if you wanted people to stop thinking about it, said Will. That's exactly what you'd say if, well, whatever people thought was likely to be right. That's true, said Carlson. That's really clever, Will. Oh, come on, demanded Will. Who hasn't been trying to work it out? He looked at Davina. She nodded. Carlson and Grover nodded as well. Even Stanley nodded. We all have, haven't we? Said Will. But do you know what I think? Maybe the problem is we all try to work it out about ourselves. You know, about each one of us. Why did he choose me? What makes me special? What makes me different? Oh, where do I start? Cried Davina, and she laughed. No, listen, I'm serious, said Will. He wiggled his feet in the pool, watching the ripples spread out from his feet. He frowned, trying to clearly see the shape of his idea, trying to put it into words. Maybe what we should ask is not what's different about each of us, but what's the same? What's the pattern? He chose us, didn't he? Maybe he chose us because of some way in which we're all similar. So what we should be asking is not what makes each one of us different, but what do we all have in common? Will looked at the others questioningly. I mean, does that make any sense? Davina shrugged. I don't know, Will, said Stanley. What we have in common, murmured Grover to himself. Carlson grinned. Look at me. Does anyone here have anything in common with me? I love magic, I admit it. I wish I had lived in the past during the Wizard Wars. At least people believed in magic then. Yeah, you would have been a real leggy spotter, said Davina. Me? I wish there was nothing to stop anyone doing anything they wanted. I'd go everywhere and see everything. There's nothing I wouldn't try. That's the kind of world I want to live in. I love termites and ants and bees and spiders, said Grover. If I could have my wish, I'd shrink down to a tiny, tiny size and explore their worlds. You can do that with high sense, said Davina. Not really, said Grover. It's not real, is it? Our high sense suits are primitive, muttered Stanley. The high sense suits we used last night weren't primitive, objected Carlson. They were great. I could feel the bugs in that jungle biting me. Stanley shook his head. Primitive. One day everything we'll do today will seem primitive. I wish I lived in the future, when we'll have the skill to program things properly, really program them, to make everything seem real. Davina grinned. I bet that's what people used to say in the past. She turned to Will. What about you, Will? I don't know. I suppose I love Patterns. Patterns? You mean like colours and shapes? No, said Will. He gazed at the water. The ripples glinted and shifted. I mean, the patterns of the way things happen. Being able to work out what's going to happen from what's happened before. To know what's going to happen because there's a pattern, you see. A pattern that tells you. Only you have to be able to see it because it isn't obvious. So you have to know how to pick it out. And what do you do with it then? Asked Davina. I don't know, murmured Will. He shrugged. It helps in pointy wibblers. Davina laughed. Oh, I don't know. Will looked at the others. Look, maybe I'm wrong. Maybe the reason Professor Gelmet chose us isn't what we've got in common. He grinned. If you ask me, if you listen to what we're saying, the only thing we have in common is that none of us have anything in common at all. The others laughed. All except Stanley. Maybe that's it, he said seriously. Maybe that's the answer. It's a pattern, isn't it? Will looked at Stanley. That there is no pattern? Stanley nodded. No. Why would Professor Gelmet do that? Demanded Davina skeptically. Why would he choose 30 people who have nothing in common? Stanley looked at Will. Will thought about it. Why would he jam your communicator, Davina? I have no idea. Thanks for joining us. Tune in tomorrow for another chapter of Will Buster and the Gelmet Helmet.